Good morning, everyone. It is Saturday, November the 30th, 2019. It is currently 10:38 a.m. Central Time, and you're listening to a live broadcast for the Theology-Central podcast. Now, if you happen to hear a recording of this podcast on YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Deezer. Okay, I can name every podcast platform in the world that we're currently on. iHeartRadio, wherever you may hear us, please know you're not getting everything that we produce and you're not getting everything that we upload. The only way to get everything is to go to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and do a search for Spreaker, S-P-R-E-A-K-E-R, Spreaker. In the app stores, it usually says Spreaker Podcast Radio. Download the Spreaker app. Once you've downloaded the Spreaker app, yes, you can tell I'm a professional broadcaster. Once you download the Spreaker Podcast Radio app, do a search for VBC. That stands for Victory Baptist Church. That is us. We produce the Theology Central podcast, the Non-Catholic Catholic podcast, the Hermeneutics 101 podcast, the Socratic Circle podcast, the VBC podcast. We produce a lot of podcasts, and there may be another one coming, all right? That if I can find a way to discipline myself, I think it would be very interesting, but we'll be talking about that soon. But once you download the Spreaker app and look for VBC, it'll say VBC by Victory Baptist Church. Tap on the by Victory Baptist Church. It will show you every show. Go under each one, tap the star, make sure you follow us, and guess what? You'll get notifications whenever I do a live show for any of those podcasts and whenever we upload a new episode. That's the only way to get all of our content. And trust me, you want all of our content. Now, for those who heard my podcast yesterday evening, I wasn't in a good place. I was not good mentally, physically. I wanted to share that. Thanks for those who did ask how I was doing. Doing much better today. Still very sad that I don't get to be with my family as they're about to board on the family cruise that I was supposed to be a part of, but because of my seizure, I'm not there. But what I'm going to do is use the best. I'm going to try to use every minute of every day that I do have to try to accomplish, things and make the most of it and to still be thankful in every situation, not necessarily thankful for every situation. But now we have to turn to a very serious topic. And I want to begin by reading John chapter 15, the Gospel of John chapter 15, and I want to read verse 18 and following. If the world hate you, ye know that it hated me before it hated you. Now this is Jesus speaking. He says, hey, if the world hate you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love his own. But because you are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. Remember the word that I said unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they have kept my saying, they will keep yours also. All right. Now I want you, and we could continue to read there, but you get the idea. Jesus makes it very clear that the world is going to hate us. Now I will argue that within American Christianity, we've done a lot, especially a lot of the evangelical church has done a lot to try to make the world love us, to try to make the world accept us, to try to make the world, respect us. And no matter what we try, no matter how much we compromise, no matter how much, we are willing to back down and to change the way we preach and change the way we teach and change the way we do church and try not to be so offensive and try not to be so harsh and try to be cool and relevant and hip, the world still ultimately hates us. It's always going to hate biblical Christianity. The only way to try to get the world to accept you is to no longer be biblical Christianity. And that means you're turning your back on Christ. You're denying the faith, and we cannot do that. Now, why am I starting this episode with that passage and with those words? Well, because this morning I woke up, and here is the headline I read. Christianity, now most persecuted religion in the world. That's the headline. And I saw that on part of Yahoo News, all right? Not a Christian news site. A normal news site. Now, we could argue how good a news site, but still a news site telling us that Christianity is now the most persecuted religion in the world. In that article, it states this: according to the latest statistics, 8 out of 10 victims of religious persecutions are Christians. I want you to hear that number. 8 out of 10 victims of religious persecutions are Christians. Now, that is as of today. Now, what's interesting, I immediately started looking up, other reports. And I found video reports from going all the way back to 2010, talking about the growing number of Christians being persecuted. And they would give different numbers. It wasn't 8 out of 10, it was less. But it's only increased, and now we're 8 out of 10 victims of religious persecution are Christians. Another newspaper said this, and I thought this was interesting. Their headline: time to pay attention to the persecution of Christians. Secular institutions need to end their neglect of 245 million Christians who face extreme persecution. Now, here's a newspaper telling secular institutions, hey, it's time to stop neglecting the persecution of 245 million Christians who are facing not just persecution, extreme persecution. Now, we hear about the persecution of a lot of different groups, right? This group. But a lot of times what is neglected is any discussion about the persecution of Christians. It's almost as if it doesn't matter. And no, it does matter. Now, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to play just I just went and found as many video reports as I could. I grabbed a bunch of them. I ripped the audio, and I'm just going to play them so that you kind of get a sense of what is happening. Now, some of these reports are 8 years old, 7 years old. Some of them are from this year. I just want you to get an overall sense of all the different things that are happening in different parts of the world and what is going on. Because I think, especially for us in America, it's easy for us just to be living our Christian life, not even really worried. We're not praying. We're not fasting for Christians who are suffering around the world. We don't even give it a lot of thought. Sometimes we will, but we don't give it much thought. And what makes it even worse is that American Christians scream persecution because they go do their Black Friday Christmas shopping and the cashier did not say Merry Christmas. And we're like, oh my goodness, we're being persecuted for our faith. They won't say Merry Christmas. And it's like, when we act like that, we are spitting in the face of those who are facing true persecution, right? Just because the world doesn't like our Christianity, doesn't want to sit there and go along with our Christianity and say mean things about our Christianity, that's not necessarily persecution, all right? Persecution, I think we need to be fair. Let's not claim persecution when it's not persecution, because it's disrespectful to those whose lives are at risk. People are being killed. People are being imprisoned. They're losing their property. They're losing their jobs. Horrible things are happening. Now, when real persecution does happen here in the United States of America, we need to speak out. But another warning for Christians: when anyone of any religion is being persecuted, we need to speak out, because we want them to have the freedom of religion and we want the freedom of religion. Do not deny others the freedom of religion, because ultimately you're denying yourself of the same freedom. All right? Very important that we make that very clear. We want to support their freedom of religion. Doesn't mean we say their religion is right. Doesn't mean that we say their religion is correct. We're not saying their religion is equal in truth claims. We're saying that we want them to have that freedom so that we can have the freedom to speak against their religion and to promote what we believe to be the truth of Christianity. We want freedom for everyone, right? Freedom denied is freedom that you lose for yourself. It's how it always works. But Jesus says we're going to be persecuted. We need to really start thinking about persecution, on what's happening around the world. And as Christians, we need to be prepared for maybe things continue to go the way some believe they're headed here in the United States of America, and we too could face persecution. And then we have to be willing to stand in the face of it. All right, I'm just going to start playing a number of reports. Listen carefully to these reports. Again, I will come back in between some of them, and I may add some commentary, but for the most part, I just want you to hear what is happening around the world and give you a sense. And this goes back, I think the earliest report I have here is from 2009 or 2010, and they go all the way up to 2019. All right, this gives you a sense of what is happening. And these are all from different news sources, all right? Sky News, I've got the South China Morning Post, Fox News, Rome Reports in English. I got a lot of different sources here, so just listen carefully. And just today, be thankful that you're not suffering persecution, but pray for those who are. Pray and fast for those who are. All right, it's very important. And maybe, and again, I don't want to use hyperbole, but maybe the time is coming that we will face literal persecution here in the United States of America. I know what Christians always say, well, good, it'll purify the church, it'll be a good thing. Okay, it's easy to talk all big and brave when you're not facing it. You change your tune when they break into your house or come into your church and grab your wife and your kids and say, renounce your faith or I kill them. I don't think you'll be sitting there going, well, it'll be a good thing. It'll purify the church. I think all of a sudden your tone will change. Sometimes, especially Christian men, we like to talk a big game. And remember, when Peter talked a big game, how he would not deny Jesus, he ended up denying Jesus. So let's be careful not to talk like we're the bravest people in the world. And realize persecution means death, and it can mean death of your loved ones, your family members. You may not be so brave when that happens. All right? Humility is what we need. All right? And it reminds every Christian, if you've got freedom today, don't waste that freedom today. Use that freedom for the furtherance of the kingdom of God and for the glory of God. All right, here are some reports about persecution, the persecution of Christians around the world. Let's listen carefully.
You have to know where to look. Hidden in a block of flats, behind a bolted door. This is what faith looks like in China. Xu Yonghai has run this underground church in Beijing since 1989. He's been to prison or re-education through labor camps 3 times because of his beliefs. But these are the darkest days he's known, as the Chinese Communist Party stamps down on any version of religion that doesn't acknowledge its supremacy.
我们主耶稣，我们是高举爱呀，我们是连仇敌都爱，他高举街头扔，高举这个，最起码他当年把这些个牧师长老抓起来，都是因为这些敌人，这都是帝国主义侵略中国的被利用的工具，肯定是我们都能感觉到，宗教不自由。
China is officially an atheist state, with freedom of religion guaranteed in the constitution. State-sanctioned churches do exist, but the power and glory belongs to the party. It keeps tight control. Worshippers are registered, CCTV cameras fitted, and the Bible is even being retranslated by the government to ensure what they call correct understanding.
你们是什么情况？你们把人带到哪里了？告诉我，我是妻子。你们要把我丈夫带到哪里？请告诉我。
But unofficial churches were tolerated until recently. Police closed this one by force in Chengdu, southwest China, in December last year. This Beijing church was also shut down in another raid last year after its leaders refused to install CCTV cameras. You used to get throngs of worshippers coming here. It was one of the biggest underground churches in China. And now there's not much left to see. We tried to go in, they said, well, there's nothing here. Then we said what we wanted to see, they said the police have shut it down. And in any case, the lift isn't stopping at the 3rd floor. There's no trace left. And that's what people practicing Christianity in China fear. They'll simply be scrubbed from existence. And in March this year, another famous church with a congregation 1,000 people strong was banned. Afterwards, they pledged to hold a prayer meeting in a public square in Beijing. We also went, but the square was simply shut down by authorities. The few brave enough to come here were quietly escorted away. Undercover police officers followed us while we filmed, then approached.
Hi, sir. Hey, it's not good. Why?
A police station opposite Pastor Shu's home church. He says it was built to keep watch over him. Everyone exists in a state of paranoia. The faithful worried for their liberty, but also the Communist Party itself, which sees threats everywhere, even here.
我们可能没有平安，也可能不知道我们未来是什么，没有平安，我们真是没有平安，看不到平安。但是呢，我们能看到我们要忍耐，多么艰难都要忍耐，坚忍下来。
如同我们免了人的债，不叫我们遇见试探。
And persist they will, but only as long as the party lets them. Tom Cheshire, Sky News, Beijing.
Now there we have persecution by a government, governmental persecution in this communist China. Atheistic government goes after religion, all right? And just make sure we understand that. An atheistic government, a lot of times atheism talks about, hey, atheism is wonderful, it's great, and we don't care what anyone does. Well, atheistic governments throughout history, they do care, and they persecute religious individuals. They persecute religion. Now, within China, it's not just Christians being persecuted, Muslims are being persecuted as well. Again, we have to keep it in perspective. We don't want anyone being persecuted, but that's governmental persecution. Now, remember the headline I read today stated, or the article that I started this podcast with, according to the latest statistics, 8 out of 10 victims of religious persecutions are Christians. That's an 8 out of 10 number. Let's go back a few years when the number wasn't 8 out of 10. It was 1 in 12. Let's listen to that report.
When the founders wrote the Declaration of Independence, they invoked our Creator 4 times. Because in America, we don't worship government, we worship God.
That was President Trump this morning at Liberty University. Christians here in the Middle East are really hoping this administration will stand stronger against persecution, as hundreds of thousands of Christians have been forced to flee their home countries facing civil war and Islamic terror. Chris Mitchell is the Mideast Bureau Chief for the Christian Broadcasting Network, and he is also the author of a new book, ISIS, Iran, and Israel, What You Need to Know About the Current Mideast Crisis and the Coming Mideast War. On that happy note, Chris, nice to see you. There is something about your shot that I want to point out to our viewers, is that over your shoulder is a Christian cross that's lit up. It's a church, one of the many churches inside the old city. And it is increasingly becoming that Israel, the Jewish homeland, is the only state in the Middle East that you can be a Christian.
Yeah, first of all, Elaine, it's great to see you back here in Jerusalem.
It's good to be here.
And that's a great point, because Israel is the only place where Christians are not leaving. Almost every other nation in the Middle East, you can go from Iran all the way to North Africa, you can find that Christians are leaving, whether in northern Iraq or Syria. It's really kind of an exodus in the last several years, even back the last 10, 20 years. You've seen hundreds of thousands of Christians leaving the area, and sometimes being taken out of their homes.
Well, and to this point, some are leaving because they want to, but a lot are leaving because they have to.
Exactly. We spoke with a guy named Ammar back in Jordan. He lived in a town called Karakosh, and there were 60,000 Christians in Karakosh, and this is what happened in August of 2014 when the church bells rang, and he had to flee with his wife, his 2 children, and also about 60 other Christians. Right now he's in Jordan. He can't work in Jordan. It's hard for him to go to a third country, and right now he can't go back to his hometown.
Well, he can't go back and stay alive. We saw during the very beginning of the Trump administration, the first travel ban included preference for Christian refugees. And that travel ban, as we know, is now working its way through the courts, as is the second one. Is there any active measures by the U.S. government, by this administration, to try and provide a safe haven for so many of the people you've reported on?
That's a big thing. In Karakosh, we were up there. This is the same village that Ammar left a couple of years ago. That's what they were asking for, a safe zone so that Christians can have some sort of security. They don't want to go back to their homes in a year or two, ISIS or some other manifestation comes. And I think the one thing that they're doing right now is they're speaking out on behalf of Christians. Right after he was inaugurated, he had an interview with a colleague of mine, David Brody, who said that he was going to stand up for Christians. Just a few days ago, Vice President Mike Pence was at a major conference for Christians in defense of persecuted Christians, who spoke up. And the message they're saying is that we hear your cry, we won't ignore you. And they have been ignored for many years.
Will good actions follow good words? Big change with this administration for sure. But have we seen any concrete actions? Have we seen an increase in the number of visas? Are we seeing any type of extra help or allowance for charities? What's your reporting shown?
Right now, no. I think they haven't shown any extra visas, but I think that's going to take a while, several months. I think the seriousness of the fight against ISIS is one thing that I think encourages a lot of Christians right now here in the Middle East. They think that Trump is going to hopefully bring stability, and they also see in him a strong leader. And strength matters in the Middle East, and weakness has consequences, and I think we've seen that to the Christians here in the Middle East for the last several years.
Well, they could certainly use some folks with some strength standing behind them. President Trump delivering that sort of religious message and strength, not only in Saudi Arabia, but then heading here to Jerusalem, of course, and then on to Rome as well. Chris, really appreciate your time, and keep up the good work. It's hard reporting in some tough places you do.
I would say one other thing, Leland. The Middle East Christians really are asking for prayer for American Christians and the support they need from the U.S.
Well, I think we have a lot of viewers who might be adding them to their prayers come Sunday.
Now, that headline's misleading because it says 1 in 12 Christians experiencing persecution. They don't give the actual statistic in the report, but they were talking, is the Trump administration doing anything concrete? Well, now here we are, November 2019, and we have a report released yesterday saying 8 out of 10 victims of religious persecution are Christians. That would seem to tell me that the numbers have only increased. They haven't decreased. I don't know why they call that report, and that's from Fox News. Their headline is 1 in 12 Christians experiencing persecution, and they have a video where they don't even mention that statistic. So, okay, so much for Fox, so much for Fox News. Let's go to some other reports.
A new interim report released at the request of the British Foreign Secretary says Christian persecution in some parts of the world is, quote, close to meeting the international definition of genocide, with Christians being targeted by extremist groups in the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and East Asia. For more on this, we bring in the president of the Iraqi Christian Relief Council and senior fellow of the Philos Project, Juliana Taimoorazy. Juliana, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me on, Molly.
It's really startling to see that sort of figure, that takeaway from the report, that it could potentially be reaching genocidal levels. Also worth noting from this report, 80% of religious believers who are being persecuted around the world are Christians. Should this be a wake-up, a worldwide wake-up?
Absolutely. There has been a genocide that is already underway. And perpetrated by ISIS. As you know, Secretary Kerry announced this as a genocide of the Christians of Iraq and also the Yazidis. But this has been going on for so long. For example, in terms of Iraq, the Assyrians, also the Chaldeans and the Syriacs of Iraq have come under persecution starting 2003 until today. Our numbers were 1.5 million today, down to 200,000 people. And look at Sri Lanka, look at what happened there, look at what's happening in India. Nobody's really talking about India. So we're grateful for Secretary Hunt and also Ambassador at Large Brownback for really stepping up to do something in a positive way, in a more meaningful way, but there's so much that needs to get done still worldwide. According to Open Doors report, 1 out of 9 Christians, Molly, across the world are being persecuted today.
And of course, this causes not just potentially death, as we're talking about genocide, but also people being pushed out of their homelands and the religion where it perhaps had a stronghold being forced out of areas where Christians lived. I want to take a listen. This is the British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt speaking in Kenya.
around 250 million Christians being persecuted, 3,000 losing their lives last year alone, and that's increasing. And there are many different reasons for that: religious conservatism, politicians playing on people's religious prejudices, state-sponsored oppression, terrorism.
He also talked about political correctness. Do you think that plays a role?
Absolutely. Actually, I believe the death of most of the people that are suffering today is truly because of the political correctness, because the world turns a blind eye to this. And when we are politically correct, we are sympathizing with those terrorists that are destroying communities and erasing histories. For example, the Assyrian people in Iraq, our history, they're trying to erase our history by destroying our monuments and really pushing out us from the homeland. But you know what, Molly? Persecution looks different in different parts of the world. For example, let's take Iran. According to the International Christian Concern, they did a report. In 2017, there were 16 former Muslims that were persecuted. But in 2018, 171 former Muslims, and also 3 Assyrians that are being persecuted today, Pastor Victor and his family, for example. In Egypt, they are giving the Christians a hard time to legalize churches. We saw what ISIS did in Sri Lanka. So the way we answer every persecuted situation, it has to be different. For example, Boko Haram in Nigeria. We have to deal with them differently.
And perhaps these horrific attacks in Sri Lanka also will be seen as a wake-up call. Juliana Taimoorazy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on. Thank you.
Now, they give a 1 out of 9 number, again, from this morning, 8 out of 10. Now, that was, I think, 2018. So you're talking in a year, the numbers have increased that much. We're getting a lot of different numbers thrown at us, which makes it very difficult. But they say that it's almost reaching genocidal levels. That's frightening and something that we need to continue. Here are 2 more reports.
Out of every 10 people, 7 cannot live their faith in full freedom. And the most persecuted religion is Christianity, with at least 200 million people suffering from discrimination. This was revealed by the report on religious freedom in the world that is published every 2 years by the Catholic organization Aid to the Church in Need. In 21 of the 194 countries studied, there is hardly any religious freedom. The report notes that there are 2 types of religious persecution, one by policy and one by members of other religions.
Political oppression, discrimination comes from places like China, from Cuba, from North Korea, partly from places like Vietnam.
The persecution that comes from other religions is particularly acute in some countries with a Muslim majority.
Places like Saudi Arabia, where it's impossible for any Christian or indeed any other group, non-Muslim group, to organize and to have open public prayer. We think of places like Somalia, or we think of Sudan.
The vice president of the Catholic Bishops of Pakistan denounced the worsening situation of Christians in their country. He says a few years ago there were no murders based on religion, and it is only now they are occurring. The government is not responsible for any of these murders. Those responsible are new fundamental Islamic groups operating behind the backs of the authorities. He also criticized the blasphemy law in Pakistan, which invokes punishments as severe as the death penalty to anyone who speaks out against the Quran or the Prophet Muhammad. The bill is dangerous because it is very difficult for the victim to prove their innocence, since most people have few resources to pay for this. So far, the government has not executed anyone for blasphemy. However, defendants have been killed by radicals outside the government.
We want to have our equality and all our rights as equal citizens of Pakistan. We are not against our country. We want to stay in the country. We are not leaving the country.
The report also reveals that religious freedom has declined in the United States and Europe by the radicalization of secularism, especially in countries like Spain, which prohibit the presence of religious symbols in public places. France was cited for the discrimination of Islamic communities, and Germany for the hostility of some sectors against the Catholic Church because of its position on family issues and defense of life. Overall, the study has shown that religious freedom has declined worldwide, and that this right is under greater threat today than it was 2 years ago.
There you have it. That one outlines at least the two kinds of persecution: governmental persecution and religious persecution. Christians being persecuted by members of other religions or other religious groups like fundamentalist Islamic groups, those who want to wipe out Christianity in the name of Islam. So two different kinds of persecution: governmental, religious. All right, here is another report.
This supervision is much more intrusive, it's much more intensive.
1 in every 3 Christians in Asia are suffering from a high level of persecution. That's according to a new report by the UK-based Christian advocacy group Open Doors. Its 2019 watch list report ranks these 4 Asian countries among the top 10 where persecutions of Christians is most extreme. North Korea tops the list for the 18th straight year. The report says there have been increased efforts by the government to eliminate all channels for spreading Christianity. The report also highlights the continued persecution of Christian minorities in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which are predominantly Muslim. And for the first time, India has broken into the top 10 of the watch list due to a rising numbers of attacks on Christians and churches by Hindu extremists. China is also on the list, ranked at number 27 this year, a dramatic rise from its position at number 43 in 2018. The report says, according to some church leaders, persecution in China is at the worst level since the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and 70s. Other Asian countries on the list include Myanmar, Vietnam, Bhutan, Indonesia, and Malaysia. To talk about this, I'm joined from the United Kingdom by Ron Boyd-Macmillan. He's the Director of Research at Open Doors International. Now, one particularly interesting finding was that there has been a significant increase in the persecutions of Christians in China. What examples can you give about that from the past year?
Perhaps one of the most significant shifts is that responsibility for the supervision of religious activity has shifted to the party organization called the United Front Work Department. And away from a government department that was called the Religious Affairs Bureau. That's been done away with. Now, this supervision is much more intrusive, it's much more intensive, and it's a way of making sure that all religion, not just Christianity, has to serve the ideological goals of the state. And under President Xi Jinping, since 2012, churches are finding that they get visited a lot more, and there are requirements, to basically tell the government everything you are doing. And this is a bit new because things were liberalizing quite significantly over the last 10, maybe even 15 years. But this is a complete reversal.
Ron, I want to see if you can tell me a little bit more about the situation in Indonesia.
There are religious extremists, Islamic extremists, and so you have churches that are targeted, and there was a horrible incident where a family went and blew themselves up in a church in Surabaya and killed Christians. And of course the governor of Jakarta was a Christian, and he was smeared really by Islamic extremists a couple of years ago, and has been serving a 2-year jail sentence because of that. So it's rather unfortunate. Indonesia used to have a reputation of being very tolerant of all the different religious traditions. This is shifting.
It's no surprise that North Korea has been top of the list for nearly 2 decades. How has that situation worsened despite Pyongyang's efforts to engage with the West?
Internally, there isn't really much change. Many of us wonder really why there's any mileage for Kim Jong-un in talking to Donald Trump, but maybe it's just a survival mechanism. But inside the country, it's just as hard to be a Christian as ever before. It's not tolerated, it's not allowed, and if you are discovered to be a Christian, it usually means jail, and then your children will also be jailed as well.
Is there any solution to this? I mean, in terms of stopping this kind of persecution across Asia and other parts of the world?
You can pressure the governments you can pray. Very often what they do is when disaster strikes, for example, in Anhui province, there were floods this year, the churches are the first to help and assist. And that impresses the government and often changes their attitude toward the church, where they see that the church can really be an ally in dealing with the challenges of society rather than a rival.
Great insight as always, Ron. Thank you so much for joining us today on SCMP.
Thank you for taking an interest. Bye-bye.
Well, there you have it. Those are all the reports. I'll just remind you of this. Persecution. Number one source, atheistic secular government. Number two, religious persecution coming from other religious groups. And the one that got mentioned over and over and over was Islam. Islam fundamentalists who persecute and try to wipe Christians off the face of the earth in particular countries. Atheistic secular governments, boom, they want Christianity gone. And in certain forms of Islam, especially the Islamic extremists, they are seeking to persecute Christians. Now, we got all kinds of different numbers. 1 out of 9, 1 out of 12, 8, the one from today, 8 out of 10 victims. We've got a report saying that's reaching almost genocidal levels, according to an international report based on the standards to say something is reaching the level of genocide. These are all coming from different sources, different reports. The one thing, we may not know exactly the number. We may not be able to figure out exactly, be able to state a statistic that's 100% accurate because we have so many different reports. And you see the numbers drastically change every year. Here's what's happening. It is time not only for secular institutions to wake up to the persecution of Christians, it's time for Christians to wake up to the persecution of Christians. Not only praying for those, seeking to do whatever we can to help those, but more importantly, also be thinking and preparing how we would handle it ourselves. So just wanted to bring this information I saw this morning, wanted to bring it to everyone's attention. Now you know to look at the two things to consider: atheistic secular government persecution and persecution coming from other religious groups. The one mentioned in all the reports was the same. Well, you have Hindus persecuting Christians. That was mentioned as well. So I take that back. Hindus and Islam. Islam was mentioned in multiple reports. So, but those are the two ways it seems to be currently working. Now that's a small sample of what's happening across the globe, but it's our job to pay close attention to it and think deeply about this. So I wanted to bring this to your attention. Obviously, we could do more study on this and more discussion, and we may do that in the future. All right, thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology Central podcast. Remember to get the Spreaker app. Look for Spreaker Podcast Radio in any app store, and then look for VBC, that is us. Once you find us, tap on Victory Baptist Church, and you can find all of our shows. Please follow us, and please tap the little star to make us a favorite so you'll get notifications for new content and when we do a live broadcast. All right, that's it for now. I'll be back later today. God bless.